Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to round 5 of the 6 MDO. Get unnamed in the valid DICI A.
DICI.
DICI. Oh, DICI A. And on the notion that ISA believes that the West should fund gay reformation, something in Russia, and I'm like the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm at a disadvantage because I have a speaker coming after me who is actually from the International Islamic University, who have built their lives opposing homosexuals. But I think he's got a lot of materials and now he will just have to use them. Fortunately, they've always been very poor material. Mr. Speaker, in this debate, what we're going to do, I know it's kind of funny, right? So, what we'll be doing in this debate is to ask for Western fund groups, for example, the Friedrich Naumann, Atlas, and Freedom Action Group, and Amnesty, to increase substantially the funding for the LGBT groups within Russia because they are under attack, Mr. Speaker, from a government unacting and want to end the phenomenon of human beings being sexually diverse. And we support diversity on this side. We suspect there's some level of diversity on that side. Mr. Speaker, more importantly, these are indirect supports from the West because they are from fund groups and not from those governments, therefore it not be antagonistic at government to government levels. Second of all, it's not unusual. It happens all the time. But we would like to up it. We'd like to show clearly that this is being done because we realize things aren't hunky-dory in Russia, that the Russian government is arming itself up to be opposing homosexuals, and therefore it needs the LGBT movement in Russia also needs to up themselves up. And how will they up themselves up? Because these funds will help them organize, increase educational support, deal with lawsuits, and none of it will be supporting any violence. And this is very important because if you want to oppose an evil empire, you've got to show that you're morally superior. We know that very well growing up in Malaysia. What I'll be doing in this debate is talking about situational analysis of Russia and the situation that's going on and why we need to act it right now. Second of all, why Putin would only respond to force, and therefore we need to make sure the people that are dealing with them have that force to deal with them. Third of all, Rafik will get up, who's now reformed Orthodox Jewish Christian. I think that's what he said. His family always tends to revolve around religions. And that is that he's going to talk about inconsistency of the morality that's happening in from the international community. Second of all, he'll talk about how these demands by the homosexual groups, by the LGBT, are not necessarily those that will jeopardize the greater interests of Russia. It only does upset the government of they in Russia. I know you're doing that in a second, ma'am. And third of all, that it is achievable because of a distracted Putin. I will let you ask that one now.
Thank you. Do you actually think that the right to sexual expression is universally recognized?
I think that it should be universally recognized. I don't think it's recognized enough in this university. I don't think it's recognized enough in many parts of the world. But we believe that people can make choices on sexuality, and that those choices should not be undermined by governments. If governments can't deal with it, we believe that they need to grow up a little. Because we believe in Russia, and this is where I get into my, so you had one point, the situation is that this is a new, relatively new phenomenon. Because for about 70 years, the Russian Orthodox Church was clamped down during the Cold War. So since it's been renewing itself in the last 20 years. Plus, you also have a born-again Christian in Putin. They feel they're going to make up for the years. And homosexuals tend to be the low-hanging fruit. So they're going after that because they can. There's a certain morality playing here. And we believe that also at the same time, the LGBT community in Russia never benefited from the movement and the evolution that occurred in the West from the 1970s, 1980s on homosexual rights. Therefore, they are not as organized as they wish to be. So now they are facing the energy of the forces of the people governing them right now, and they themselves not as organized as they need to be. And if they are not, then they are always at a disadvantage, a gross disadvantage, Mr. Speaker. Because what you're doing is, A, as I already said about this, that you face an abrasive government. Even when the international community talked about homosexual rights and how they should relax the rules and regulations for the Sochi Games, the Putin government said no. They were not willing to deal with it. Second of all, the stakeholders in Russia themselves are either indifferent or directly under government control, whether media or the courts. Therefore, the LGBT community need all the support in terms of organizing, in educating, and more importantly, in the courts that they have to deal with these people. Third, as I said, the LGBT people themselves are easy target. I think that's pretty good argumentation. Sit down, Sir Siron. Second is force versus force. The Putin government has been known, even during his first presidency, then his prime ministership, now back to presidency, is that he will only respond to force. Here's a real politic about him. Compared to the Cold War, where it was just very, you got one, that's all you get. I see you as one person. Sit down. Now, Mr. Speaker, what they respond to is force. And we believe, similar to the civil rights movement in America, you need to organize themselves in Russia. That's what you can be able to do with that funding, Mr. Speaker. We've seen Putin backing down on things like Pussy Riot. We've seen him backing down on other measures if he's confronted with groups that are organized and that are able to express themselves enough in these situations, Mr. Speaker. This debate is about whether or not you upset the Russian government of the day, not Russia or the Russian people, and whether or not this support can, in real terms, provide the essential and crucial support for the LGBT communities in Russia to put themselves, get themselves together in a way that they can deal and improve the conditions of the LGBT community. We don't think necessarily this fund will change the minds of the government overnight, neither will it force anything, but as all fights, it begins with the willingness to fight and it begins with the willingness to support that fight. And that is why the West can't turn its eyes away from this. We beg to propose.
Ladies and gentlemen, side government do not know what evil empires are. I come from IIU. I know what evil empires are. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, there are 3 things in my speech I'll be talking about in today's debate. Firstly, I'll be telling you why the West has no right to intervene. We feel it is unwarranted. Secondly, we will tell you why people in Russia do not support this particular push for homosexual rights or the LGBT movement. And lastly, I'll be telling you how this particular government policy is going to systematically disempower current initiatives that are in motion right now. But before that, a couple of lies I need to deal with first, right? First and foremost, to avoid this Western government idea they wanted to defend, they decided to say, let's have Amnesty International, which is just about as likely as a Western government. Let's look at what Amnesty International has done. They have systematically abused the idea of what evil is and labeled Russia as an evil empire that is unjust. The same characterization, not going your way. No, thank you, this means sit down. Now, what happens here is that when Amnesty International, let's just be rude. Yeah, you taught me better than that. When it comes to Amnesty International, this particular human rights group is so pro-West that literally it embodies the word United States of America and other countries in the far West, right? Because Russia isn't West enough. Let's go on to the second issue, the universality of rights. This is where we feel Debating 101 has failed them. Because when you talk about something being universal, you are arguing in absolute. Now, this is what he said. Sexual freedom should be universal. That means put at the highest pedestal possible, which means you brand and you create a hierarchy of us now not being able to say that religion should also be universal then. How is your sexual freedom more important than the religious freedom of a Christian Orthodox community that is conservative in nature? Do not piss on my religion, say it. Right? Lastly is the idea of how Putin reacts to force. This is another lie. What did he say? He told you that when the human rights groups pressured Vladimir Putin to give up the Pussy Riot group or members of it, they let him go. First and foremost, a clarification. He gave up the Pussy Riot members in jail because he wanted to. You can't force Putin, just as how you can't force them out of Crimea right now. Okay? So when it comes to this particular idea, it is a blatant lie. The rest of the argumentation that I have will also deal with the things that we came up and talked about earlier. I will give you a chance if you have a question for me now. No? Good. Let's go on the first idea. Why the West has no right to intervene. It's a classic argument, right? As a government, as a country, you must be able to make laws and policies that reflect societal demands. And we do not think that societal demands is unjust or unfair in this case, especially when religious freedom of these individuals are a priority to 85% of individuals who live in that particular demographic circle. No, thank you. You can ask me nicely, right? So what happens here is that you need to understand you are literally using a foreign entity to come in and play cards and dictate how a government should make their laws and how a government should not make their laws, which is in principle here wrong because this foreign group or entity does not reflect the will of the society or the demand of the society within that particular geographical area. Second, before that, yes.
Wait a minute. This is about funding Russian organizations within Russia, LGBT groups, to be doing the work. How is it not necessarily a Russian initiative?
I will deal with that later when I come to organic change, right? Let's go on to the second thing. Why people in Russia do not support this, right? Let's look at what their policy does. In Russia, there are different groups of individuals, right? In any society, you have the moderates, you have the individuals who are more progressive and modern, people who are younger, and you have individuals who are conservative in nature. Now let's break it down. Let's look at the people who are conservative in nature. Let's see what this particular policy is going to do to them. You're going to have already 85% of them who are already ultra-conservative and Catholic in nature, right? Catholic in nature, then they will not change their mind at all, which means you're going to vilify their religion, you're going to vilify their beliefs, you're going to make them feel even more, it's not fictional, stop heckling guys, you're mature enough, right? So when it comes to the idea of the vilification of these people, you have people above the age of 60, 70, all these old timers who are not going to be happy with this kind of foreign push from outside into the people. That's why people don't support it when they're conservative. When you look at the modern individuals who are from the new generation, right? Let's look at them working together. Right now, the current individuals like you and I, obviously we are more exposed to the media, the understanding, and we feel that homosexuals should have more freedom. But unfortunately, these individuals now are going to be stuck and pushed to the corner by individuals who are already dominant within the discussion right now, and you're angering these individuals who are already dominant within the discussion. And if you look at the moderates, these individuals are open to information. They are most probably going to side with the state because they do not want to receive and they are not as receptive or they do not resonate with people from outside or foreign entity telling them what to do, because Russia is just never going to be Western enough for them. We don't think that's fair, or that's a premium or standard that is fair for them to put on Russia as a label. Lastly is the idea of the disempowerment of current initiatives. Let's look at what this policy does. First and foremost, it politicizes the idea of you being in character. So if you want to be gay, you can't be gay, or that discussion is now muffled or dies out, because the real discussion, the current discussion that takes hold is that if in fact the evil empire is as such, right, they're just going to say, oh, this is foreign intervention, this is ideas from the West, it is a propaganda idea, we're just going to mask this real discussion of whether homosexuals should get their rights or not. So in this evil empire that you define as bad, it's probably going to do this anyways. You can't achieve anything positive out of that. Secondly, when you look at the idea of these groups, you're diminishing the credibility of these current groups that are functioning in these governments, because you say you want to help them. You can't help them. They want to assume that they are the ones helping the organic change, but it's induced and forced from outside, which means any form of current organic credibility that they have now is diminished and it dies out, because all the government has to say is this is not what society wants. I know what society wants. This is from the other side of the hemisphere, and this is why we don't think you as the LGBT movement or a group has any credibility to argue against us. Mr. Speaker, when you look at it at a nutshell, you have a government that's only exacerbating the situation in Russia. This isn't Uganda where these people are being killed and shot. They have rights, they do live in certain aspects where they don't get benefits as if they get tax breaks or marriages. But it's not that bad. Deal with that.
Mr. Speaker, the Dunkel Institute for Cultural Improvement is an organization for cultural improvement, ladies and gentlemen. As a matter of fact, we'd like to culturally improve the opposition side, perhaps by starting to get them some matching clothes, especially Habib's, because it doesn't look good. We had a side opposition, ladies and gentlemen, who displayed immaturities when they refused to acknowledge the characterizations that my fantastic Prime Minister, who has had experiences in political sciences, all these things that Prabha set down, such as the fact that their homosexuality or the acceptance of homosexuals is already a general consensus in Russia. The only problem is that the Russian elites and the majority of the Kremlin are in fact, like Russian Orthodox elites who are not going to budge. They completely ignore the analysis of how these LGBT groups in Russia are disadvantaged because of, like the re-emergence of the Russian Orthodox Church and their need to antagonize these groups to look better. They completely ignore Prabha's analysis of how Putin operates and how the Russian government operates and how they respond to strength in forces. Because apparently, ladies and gentlemen, the reason why Putin released the Pussy Riot members is because Putin wanted to. Apparently, only Habib knows what happens in Putin's head. In my speech today, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk to you about all these things. I'm going to talk to you about why homosexual acceptance of homosexuals is ideologically palatable for the Russian government and the Russian community, unlike, for example, funding democratic or liberal groups in Russia. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about why Putin won't react belligerently as they asserted and claimed to you. Thirdly, I'm going to talk to you about the moral consistency of Western groups. Fourthly, I'm going to talk to you about the morale of the LGBT community a little bit later. But before that, a few to the leader of opposition. Obviously, all he thinks, like when we mention NGOs, the only thing he thinks of is Amnesty International. There are a variety of other groups that Prabha had already mentioned. We can list them out as many as they want. All his problem was that some groups are politically biased towards the West. Yes, we get that. But again, this isn't about us fighting for gay marriage. This isn't about us pushing oh, we need more homosexual representation. Russia has outlawed homosexuality and sent homosexuals to prison, ladies and gentlemen, and we cannot accept this. No. What they said to you, what did they say? And you listen to Habib's speech. He said that Russia should have the religious freedom to send homosexuals to prison, ladies and gentlemen. He asserted to you that 85% of Russians are principally and religiously opposed. There is no country in the world that 85% of the people are fundamental religious, ladies and gentlemen. That was a lie. He told you that we will anger conservatives. That's completely a lie. The only people we will anger are the old Russian Orthodox elites, and we don't think that they constitute a large part of the population. They are defending the oppression of the homosexuals in Russia. Never once in Habib's speech did he show you how Putin is likely to change or to what incentives would Putin change. We showed to you that analysis. They failed in that burden. Then he said, oh, hang on, this is some, like running all the classic arguments that he has in his case file. We need organic change. This is foreign intervention, ladies and gentlemen. It is not. There are existing LGBT movements in Russia who go on the ground. The only problem is that they do not have the resources. They do not have the organizational capacity required in order to spur large-scale, extensive civil rights movement, ladies and gentlemen. That is what we are providing them. There was no principal clash, ladies and gentlemen. They don't want to do anything. All they're saying is that Russia's so bad, there's no point in trying to change. At least we're doing something about that. Then he said, oh, hang on, we have discourse. People talk. People talk about homosexuality. That's not true. The media is controlled by the state. Prabha told you, the media is controlled by the state. The court's controlled by the state, ladies and gentlemen. Anyone who comes out as a homosexual is immediately ostracized. There's no support systems for these groups. That's what we're providing. Moving on. Why does this policy accelerate change, Mr. Speaker? The first is that Putin, how will this accelerate change? Because we think that the acceptance of homosexuals, remember, all that we're fighting for is that homosexuals are no longer persecuted or prosecuted, ladies and gentlemen, right? We think that acceptance of homosexuality is something that a lot of governments, regardless of religious backgrounds or regardless of like political ideologies, this is something that everyone can generally accept. Even within countries like America, for example, with large-scale conservative majorities, these are things that everyone can accept. We don't think this is the same as funding a liberal movement in Russia or funding rebels in Chechnya. This isn't that, ladies and gentlemen. This is simply these Western groups, funding these LGBT movements to keep them safe, Mr. Speaker. So, why won't Putin react belligerently as they asserted to you? First thing we think is that Putin responds to strength and power. We showed you examples of, for example, like the Pussy Riot and other political prisoners in Russia were released upon Russians coming onto the streets and protesting against the government, ladies and gentlemen. Putin needs to consolidate power. He cannot act all authoritarian. He knows this isn't the Cold War anymore. He will respond if a large majority of the Russian population is ready to get behind the LGBT movement. But at the moment, the LGBT movement is sporadic and it's fractionalized, ladies and gentlemen. If we can organize them into a singular community, something that the Russian people can get behind, something that the Russian people can go on the streets and fight for, Mr. Speaker, Putin will respond. We point to examples during the Cold War, for example, when Russians rioted against the oil tycoons in Russia. They rioted against violence and the fact that Russia were funding the violence in Bosnia. Before that, yes?
Yeah, you kind of confusing me. Like, first, on one hand, you say that the people are so powerful that they can force Putin to release people that are deemed as terrorists. But on the other hand, you say that these organizations really aren't that powerful, aren't that resourceful. Which one is it?
Yeah, it's the second one first. So they're not powerful enough. We give them the funds, we allow them to organize and unionize together, something that the Russian people will get behind. That means that when another homosexual goes to prison, when another homosexual is shot dead in the streets, that means that the Russian people have something to get behind. And I don't mean that as a sexual pun. Thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, I want to talk to you about image management, right? Putin already has a lot on his plate. He's taking heat for violence in Syria. He's taking heat for the whole Ukraine issue and the Eurasian Customs Union. He's taking heat for all of this. He is not going to be able to consolidate his power if he starts going after the low-hanging fruit of homosexuals. Again, not a sexual pun. Lastly, ladies and gentlemen, the morality LGBT movement. If we want the LGBT movement to Russia to have long-term reformation, we need persistence. We need people to believe in something. We need an organization that people can enter and join. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we think that when the West funds these groups, we are sending them a message that you are not alone, and that the West is there with you, and that we will be there with you, and we're in there for the long haul, and we will not stop fighting until we see some reformation.
Well, Mr. Speaker, listening to the government team in this debate, you forget that Prabha has actually been around long enough to have learnt from Tim Sonrak, to have learnt two important things. First, that having a consistent characterisation is actually necessary for your arguments to make sense in a debate. Secondly, that your problem and solution should actually match one another. Let's address those two things first of all. What was the characterisation we got from the government team in this debate about Russia and Putin's reign? On the one hand, he is apparently so controlling and so manipulative that he runs a totalitarian state where he controls the media, the courts, the police, the education system, and apparently forces Russians to believe that homosexuality is bad where they otherwise wouldn't have. But on the other hand, he's on the verge of tipping over by virtue of all the pressure he's facing over Syria and Crimea and a whole bunch of other issues, right? What the reality is kind of somewhere in the middle, and that's what they needed to engage with, right? The guy has a lot of power. It is true. The guy does do a lot of bad stuff. That is also true. He is also capable over time of responding to pressure from society about those things. That pressure is far more likely to come under our policies. That's the first problem I had with their team. The second was this problem solution thing. They said on the one hand, he only, no thank you, responds to force, and then their policy was to give a little bit more money to the same groups of people they told us for the past 30 years hadn't been able to capitalise on the international movement for gay rights. Let's engage why they haven't been able to capitalise. It's not because they don't have enough money to leaflet people. It's because gay rights is branded as a Western construct. It is branded as a construct that comes from liberal nations that necessarily oppose Russia. And that's true, incidentally, affirmative team, if this is the US government or if it's Amnesty International, because the way they're perceived by Russia is one and the same. Let's be clear about what Amnesty International and all of the other charities they wanted to talk about in this debate do. They, on a daily basis, campaign against the Russian government. They campaign against them on the basis of a whole bunch of issues, not just their treatment of gay people. Those types of charities are regularly thrown out of this country by virtue of their opinions of Putin that they attempt to put into the media. It is one in the same in terms of the way these things are going to be perceived, and they never actually wanted to engage with that, aside from a quip about how we only talked about Amnesty International. Now that I've done my kind of ranting, I'm going to ask two questions in this speech: substantive, rebuttal, interweave, classic Gemma. First, is spending this money actually an appropriate thing to do in the context where there are many things that these charities care about, and some of them are no thank you, more important than others? Secondly, is spending this money actually going to be useful in a context in which other people, groups who hate gay people, have a crap load more money that they're going to spend? Okay, let's talk about whether spending this money is appropriate. Because they thought they had us in this debate by not setting this up as being a Western government, but rather as a whole bunch of charities, right? Let's engage with the system of charities. Let's talk about Amnesty International. It is fighting for rights for individuals, minorities and otherwise, across the world all the time in a context of limited funding. And this is a genuine limited funding argument, not one that applies to governments, right? Governments can print more money, governments can find more resources. Amnesty International cannot. It relies upon donors. Those things are stagnant and they get less and less as financial crises take over. In a context where they do not have a significant pool of money, this is an actual choice, no thank you, that you need to make in this debate about where that money goes. And let's be clear, even if we think fighting for gay rights is the most important priority, which we obviously don't, in a context where people are killed regularly for a whole host of things in totalitarian regimes, even if we think gay rights is key, let's compare the situation of Russia, which we agree is unideal, to the situation of most gay people living in African countries in the world or living in Latin American countries in the world, where they're not locked up in a jail for being gay, but their names are printed on the front of a newspaper and they are lynched to death, and the government doesn't give a crap and lets those people walk out onto the streets. The question you need to ask is, for Amnesty International has a certain pool of money, where should it go? We say it should go to funding those types of things in Uganda, where you literally cannot be alive and be a gay person, and go to Russia, where sometimes you are put into jail if you express your sexuality in public. We think there is a scale of harm in this debate they do not want to engage with in the context of limited funding. But we also think it is not the responsibility of Western charities to put their other operations in jeopardy. The reality is that the risk to the operations inside Russia of these charities is huge when they take on the idea of gay rights. And the reality is they could very well be kicked out, their operations could meaningfully be shut down, and they would cut off the services they are currently able to provide to people who are oppressed for a whole host of reasons in a far worse way than just not being able to publicly express your sexuality, which is not meaningfully as bad as the actual threat of death which exists to many people in these countries and others. Sure.
You keep saying that the Russian government is far oppressive and far strong. Then at the same time you expect the organization to organically
that is true. Because the trade-off in this debate is time. We agreed that organic change takes longer. That was the analysis we provided. I'm going to get you to that in just 1 second. Okay, so, no thank you. So, we don't think this is an appropriate way to spend money. We think it's clearly not a useful thing. Let's talk about usefulness though. A, it is clear that these things will be seen as Western. It is clear that the entire gay rights movement in these countries is branded as Western. And this engages with that POI and engages with something they didn't want to talk about in this debate, which is how do you change the minds of the people who are either indifferent, as they suggest, or who are meaningfully opposed to homosexuality because it conflicts with a whole worldview that they have that opposes those things. The way you do it is over time, because generations, as they come into a society that is more liberalised and believes in gay rights, are less likely to be as extreme. As religion gets less and less power, as a society becomes richer and more educated, those things less necessarily as whole. But also, more importantly, as Putin dies and the government changes and his 30-year-long reign ends, you're far more, no thank you, likely to be able to influence those things. That's actually how you get change in these places. The way you don't do it is by connecting your fight for gay rights with an opposition to the Russian government and what it means to be a Russian. And this is what Habib told you in his speech that you actually didn't hear. You might want to turn the hearing aid up. What he actually told you is that the reality of these places is that you want to be seen as a Russian nationalist first. You want to compartmentalize your sexuality such that it's not the defining characteristic of you, because you're much more likely to be relatable to an average indifferent person in that circumstance. They necessarily do the opposite thing of that. But finally, and here's where the new kicker comes in. Who has more cash? Let's even presume that cash made a difference in this debate. We think it's old, really angry Russian Orthodox men who own all the natural resources in that country and have been profiteering off Putin's regime for the past 30 years. And we point you to Prop 8 as a prime example of this, where the gay community and LGBT communities in the United States were outcompeted 5-1 by the Catholic Church, and we ended up overturning gay marriage. The reality is we can never win a fight on the basis of money. The Catholic Church will always win out when it comes to Amnesty International, and Amnesty International has far bigger priorities. That's what we stand for inside opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, we think the opposition team took an alarmist attitude towards this debate. We think they over-exaggerated the reactions that will happen in Russia. We think that the way they characterize this is as if it's a colonization and an ideological challenge to the government, despite 85% of Habib's speech being boring, ladies and gentlemen. Now let's first look at a few things in response to the speaker before me. The speaker before me talked about how now the LGBT rights and movements towards enfranchising the LGBT community is seen as a Western construct. They are assuming that people in Russia are dumb. Your innate feeling towards another person, just like my love for Prabha and Rafiq, ladies and gentlemen, is not a construct or a concept, ladies and gentlemen. People in Russia know that these things are inherent, and people are being oppressed by virtue of this innate feeling. So we don't think that if these people fight for LGBT rights, it will be perceived as neo-colonization, a new idea that people suddenly got, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, they talked about how funds are insufficient from these organizations, and therefore the change that we seek to see won't happen, ladies and gentlemen. We don't think that the funding comes from a unitary body like Amnesty International, which was the only body that they wanted to talk about when we gave you a variety of bodies like ACLU and FNF, ladies and gentlemen, in order to shore up LGBT movements within these countries. We think when there is a consolidated effort from the West, where different organizations put their minds together and are committed in helping people in Russia, ladies and gentlemen, we think those funds will help people on the ground. We don't think that maybe change will also take a long time under our side, but at least we are giving the LGBT community in Russia the right to self-defense, ladies and gentlemen. They are being oppressed. We need to give in those resources so that they get to defend themselves. Secondly, they talked about how now if Amnesty International and ACLU diverts funds towards the LGBT community in Russia, then we won't fund things in Uganda and people will die, ladies and gentlemen. This is a really dumb argument if you think about it, considering crises around the world are time sensitive, and that's the nature in which donation takes place. If there's a crisis in Uganda, obviously Amnesty International and the international community will shore up funds to help people in Uganda. But when we're talking about homosexual or LGBT movements, ladies and gentlemen, this is an ongoing thing that requires consistency, ladies and gentlemen, and we think what we do will be sufficient to help people on the ground, and we don't think we're jeopardizing, it's not a trade-off where we're jeopardizing crisis in other places. But lastly, we think it is ridiculous for them to come out here and make a value judgment of what kind of violence is acceptable and what kind of violence is not. What they're saying now is that people getting killed in Uganda are more important than sexual minorities being oppressed, ladies and gentlemen, and they're making that value judgment. We don't think that's fair. People get killed in Russia as well. They get thrown into prison. They get demoralized, ladies and gentlemen, and we think it harms the movement as a whole. And that is problematic from that side of the house. Now let's look at whether or not people will clamp down on the LGBT community, because that seemed to be the strongest material. See, I'm doing it again, Prabha, dealing with the strongest material from that side. Yes, Gemma.
Do you think if this was a war of money, that those charities, regardless of what you call them, are likely to win?
Yes. No, we think, ladies and gentlemen, there is an asymmetry of power between the LGBT community and the government. And these are structural things that the government monopolizes, things such as the media, things such as courts, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, our case is not perfect. The LGBT community may not win absolutely on this battle, ladies and gentlemen. But at least we're helping them defend themselves against this government, allowing them to use the government structures and fight using governmental structures to create change. Without empowerment and resources and being able to organize themselves, ladies and gentlemen, we think it will be impossible for organic change to take place. Now let's look at organic change, because that's apparently the thing that they have been supporting. They have two things. Number one, the death plan. The death plan. Putin will die soon and things will change. That's what they said about Mugabe. He's still alive, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know where these people go to get their health care. Ladies and gentlemen, we think that is they're gambling on uncertainty and willing to risk the short-term losses and oppression that people have to go through. People like you and me that didn't choose to be homosexuals, but by virtue of a biological nature, we are being oppressed because they decided that organic change might happen. Now I'm hungry. I feel like having vegetables after listening to that term, organic change. But ladies and gentlemen, we think that that is uncertain on that side of the house. And furthermore, we think that the kind of things that they talked about, like economic growth and making people more liberal, ladies and gentlemen, will suddenly change things. They themselves consider that this is a religious thing. It's dogmatic, ladies and gentlemen. And we think if they wanted to achieve organic change, they have to show why religion within this country, why that strong feelings against homosexuals will change, ladies and gentlemen. What we think is happening under the status quo right now is that there is a normative predisposition that society has towards homosexuals. There's a misrepresentation of the nature of homosexuals and the LGBT community. What we do, ladies and gentlemen, with this funding and resources is that we get information out to the public. When people get to defend themselves in the court of law, or get to commit to civil suits, for example, ladies and gentlemen, or get education and awareness campaign out there, we think people will have a clearer understanding of what the LGBT community needs, and they will sympathize with the plight of this LGBT community. Lastly, we think if they won't clamp down on this thing, because supporting LGBT rights isn't an ideological challenge. It isn't a challenge to Putin's political patronage. It doesn't affect them geopolitically, ladies and gentlemen. But secondly, with all the heat that Putin is facing right now over Crimea and their geopolitical stance on things like Syria, ladies and gentlemen, we think it is more difficult for Putin to clamp down on LGBT because more heat will be put on him, and he can't afford that geopolitically, ladies and gentlemen. That's why we don't think that will happen. And furthermore, we think that if Putin clamped down on people even harsher than they already are doing, ladies and gentlemen, Putin loses moral legitimacy. You have to recognize that he is a dictator, but he used democratic processes in order to consolidate power. That means if enough people are against him, ladies and gentlemen, he will pander to the demands of the people, ladies and gentlemen, and he can't afford to lose moral legitimacy. Ladies and gentlemen, clamp down is already happening. How worse can it get if we throw in some money to facilitate these people, ladies and gentlemen? Our worst case scenario is that we might not change policies, but at least people will be more accepting towards LGBT community because we normalize the idea and make people understand them better. For all of those reasons, we propose.
the side of opposition has been called exaggeration. We've been called drama. We've been called many things. But what we've done is we've given you a most accurate depiction of consequences of their model. If you're saying that there won't be that much of a reaction, if that it won't be that damaging, then how much of a change will your model really cause? We think there's a lot of problems in this team, and inconsistency is definitely one of them. I'll do two things for you in my speech today. Firstly, I will very briefly talk about the softest model in the world by a debate team, by engaging to you why these organizations don't have an obligation to fund these progressive movements. But secondly, I'll talk about whether or not the outcomes will be beneficial. We think it's a lot more harmful. Firstly, do these organizations have an obligation to fund? They decided to pick organizations that are heavily reliant on funding by individuals that suffer from donor fatigue. That is heavily reliant on perception management, ladies and gentlemen. That means this team cannot draw a distinction between Western organizations and Western states. Because in order for Western charities to gain more money, they need to send a perception that they are doing good things, that they are doing things that are beneficial for the people in Russia. That means people will know that you are helping these individuals. You will incur the wrath of the Russian government. You will incur the wrath of the people that are in the middle. People know where the money is coming from, guys. You can't sneak in a model like that. Secondly, they also decided to say, wait, these guys only wanted to talk about Amnesty International. We don't care what the name is. All these charity organizations are heavily reliant on funding and donation that is limited in its capacity. Therefore, the question that they asked us earlier, why are you willing to draw a moral distinction about who suffers where and how? We think you're putting the moral dilemma on charitable organizations to now choose. Because not only are you correct about Ugandan homosexuals being persecuted, but they are also less persecuted than other individuals around the world. So you are placing that moral dilemma on charitable organizations. We know what to prioritize. We think it's a fight and a battle for your civil rights is much more effective when you're alive, right? Let's move on. They say also, hey, the Great Death Plan. First of all, let's look at who's playing the gamble here. This side of the house wants to ignore all the severe harms that will exist. They want to ignore that there's a lot more money into that is willing to be funded by individuals that think it's their duty to give money to a cause or else they go to hell. Versus groups of individuals that are pouring in money and do not see any actual results. Your funding is split, the results are a lot less. Before I move on, I'll take Rafiq.
Sir, your depiction of an average Russian is a vodka-drinking nationalist who will never want to change. But we told you that homosexual acceptance is not a political ideology.
Sure, I agree, and we'll talk about why you make that situation even worse. You will make society even more conflicted. Even the people that want to support the gay rights movement will now not support because they are anti-Western ideals, right? Let's talk about that. Firstly, will the outcomes be more beneficial? They were a bit dodgy on this. They said, look, Putin has a lot of power, Putin controls the media, Putin controls the court. This was already outlined in Jamal's responses. We had no defense on this ground. Instead, what Shafiq said was this. Shafiq said, hey, these things are geopolitical. Any movement by a political leader that reduces his capacity to increase his jurisdiction is an attack on his reputation and his political position. We think that's a concession that if it doesn't affect his power at all, why isn't it done already, right? So there is some leverage upon his position. No, sit down. Secondly, Shafiq told us, hey, this is an accelerated, Rafiq told us it's an accelerated progress upon the gay rights movement. This is a largely value neutral argument. So like if we prove there are more harms to your model, you accelerate the harms and the damages suffered by the Russian society. You did nothing with that substantive. Sit down, right? Secondly, what else happens? We think that where people will be divided, the direct reaction upon the Russian people is that you create a division. Not only are there a strong middle group of people that want to support the gay rights movement, but may not be too decisive on it. What do? You split them up, ladies and gentlemen. You split the people that want to support the gay rights cause, because now they don't just support the gay rights cause, they support the cause, they want to go against an anti-Western ideal. So you split the groups of people that were on the edge, that couldn't decide. So you made the support a lot more difficult. Sit down. Next, they told us, okay, then the burden is on opposition to prove how long-term will defeat all the harms. This is how you do it. We told you the trade-off was time. One of those possibilities is that Putin will die. That is true, because humans die with age, ladies and gentlemen. But the other like 5 analyses that Gemma told you was this, that religion will eventually lose its moral standing. Why? Because the narrative that you will see from this team that is empowered by LGBT groups on the ground is that I am Russian first and I'm gay second. They don't do that. They divide the attention and the support given to individuals that subscribe to these associations. Sit down. When you have a model that describes I am Russian first, I, as Traffic says, a nationalist, ladies and gentlemen, you provide support for basic rights for Russians in general. Not that we support, we provide support for gay people in Russia. That's how long-term, that's how the trade-off, that's how we presented it. They didn't have a response. But the last thing I will definitely defend is this argument about the rights to self-defense. But sure, we think everyone has a right to defend their civil liberties and their self-actualization. But we've sufficiently proven with the magnanimity of the resources at the church's possession. Like at one point, like 10 years ago, the Vatican Church was the 2nd largest financial entity in the world, right? So you don't defend them. You encourage more funding from these parties, from these stakeholders to pump in a lot more money because you make it a Western ideal. It is not time sensitive, ladies and gentlemen. A lot of things are time sensitive, but this is less urgent, and because of the financial capacity that you yourself were not able to defend, we have to choose. And we choose to support, and we choose to allow organizations, and we choose to encourage organizations to support individuals that at least have an opportunity to defend themselves while they're still breathing. Thank you very much.
It was interesting in this debate that in the first affirmative speech, we didn't even really hear what it's like to be a gay person who lives in Russia, but for you are occasionally jailed by virtue of sodomy being illegal. The reality is that it's not a great place to live if you're a gay person, and we conceded that. But it's also not the worst place to live if you're a gay person. The reality is that what you need to do is hide your sexuality. You can't be public about it, you can't express it, and we accept that's a meaningful limitation on your happiness. But by no means is it the greatest limitation on your happiness in this debate. And that's the thing that the affirmative team didn't really want to engage with. I'm going to ask 2 questions to summarise this debate. First, will this influx of money actually do anything positive in these circumstances, and at what cost? So, will it do anything positive? The first question we need to answer is, what will the money be spent on? What we heard from the affirmative team in the debate was that it will be spent on things like educational campaigns and information and fighting lawsuits. All the while, they maintain that in Russia right now, Putin has total control of the media, education system, information to the populace, the courts, and the police. So what they actually acknowledged in setting up that characterization is that it would be very unlikely that even with more money, these groups are capable of publicly informing people, of fighting lawsuits against an oppressive state that necessarily disagrees with their opinion as it stands right now, and a state that was capable of arbitrarily jailing people by virtue of causing discontent. A characterization that came from them, which was totally inconsistent with their idea about how this money would be spent. But the question we then needed to ask is, how will other groups respond? Because the reality is there isn't just one group that's willing to spend money on gay rights. There's another big, very important group, and that's a group of people who oppose gay rights in this debate. And this wasn't like a fabricated harm. We gave you a concrete example of where it had happened in Proposition 8. And they didn't want to respond to it. The fact that the Catholic Church was able to outcompete gay charities like Equal Love and like Amnesty International about 5-1 and ultimately defeated what was actually a popularly supported thing, right? Meaningfully, like a better situation for gay people, and still they lost because ultimately we will always lose the funding battle. If this is a question of money and who can spend more, We, in this debate, told you they would never win that question. But then let's talk about how Putin would respond. They told us two things. First, this issue is not geopolitical, and therefore Putin is far more likely to be responsive to the populace. Never engaging with the characterization of the populace, which was that for a large part of them, they were dogmatically opposed to homosexual rights, and for another large part of them, they were indifferent and probably didn't care about advocating gay rights, especially in a context where the types of charities they wanted to talk about, whatever they were named, had regularly critiqued Russia, the behaviour of its government, and the behaviour of its people to minorities who were not simply homosexual, but vast. So in that sense, it was a geopolitical concern for the Russian government, because Putin didn't like being criticised and didn't like the constant presumption that he should do something different that resembles what a Western government would do, and therefore actually didn't really have an incentive to cave, especially in a context where the populace's mind would unlikely have been changed anyway. But finally, and most importantly, in a context where the benefits they could point to were either non-existent or incredibly minimal by their own concession in Shafiq's speech, what was the cost of the policy? It was the lives of other people. Because this wasn't a crisis in Uganda that would get more funding. This was the status quo for homosexual people who live in those countries, who can not simply go about their business privately and avoid being locked up, but who are regularly beaten to death, who are regularly lit on fire. And that's just gay people in these countries. Not to mention the fact that those types of charities advocate for political dissidents and all kinds of minorities who have even less rights. So yes, we were the team that was willing to make a value judgment in this debate, a value judgment that said there are more important things than your capacity to publicly express your sexuality. Those things were life, and that was the thing they lost. We were very, very proud. So.
There's hope. Mr. Speaker, what excites me is that in this debate, not only were gays almost abandoned, Habib was completely abandoned. Because the Speaker, if it's true, it must hurt. Mr. Speaker, what we had was a second speech from the side of the opposition that fumbled into what they would like to propose as a solution to this debate. It came from a point of information almost halfway through Shame on You, halfway through her speech. And that question is, what are you going to do? And the answer was time. Time will heal. And then they made fun of the fact that Shafiq's funny, and that's tragic for them, but it's true. You can't just wait for things to change. Because right towards the end of her speech, and this is where it all falls apart, she said we should help those people in Uganda, homosexuals, similar situations, because they're being burned. So there are degrees of being killed. If the tires hung around you and lit, that's the kind of homosexual we want to help. Then we would like to have a shout out to Russian homosexuals out there. Look for tires and look for kerosene, because that's how Gemma Buckley over here will come and help you, Mr. Speaker. Because all of it that she did was say that the constructive development debate will come from me, and I'll do the reply, and then hopefully you all don't remember Siron too much. Mr. Speaker, what else did they say? It came on the first speech of this side that 85% of people in Russia have the same opinion, same dress sense, same everything. Goose-stepping everywhere, Mr. Speaker, right now. And all I want to say about to them is there is no place in the world that you're going to find 85% people agreeing on anything, Mr. Speaker. If there are lies in debates, they took it one step too far. Because then everything emanated from that. Everything emanated from that. Because they took anything we said to provide help and support within the community. They said it will divide the people and will hurt you. First of all, we never said that this movement will immediately be accepted. None of our speakers said it will be accepted immediately. We said there's an oppressed group that is being hit real hard. And they agreed to it. On that side, they are being hit hard. Except they say the distinction is they're not being as hit hard as other people in the world. That's why we don't want to help them. But we say that in itself, that weak defense they have on that side, doesn't give them get out of jail get out of jail. I may not know Tim Sonreich, I only drank with him, but I know when a prize speech is made, you don't stop that person. I'm pretty sure when we wrote the Asian Parliamentary, we knew that. Mr. Speaker, then they argued finally that this is all about allowing time to heal. If that's your case, then maybe your first speaker has to try to develop it rather than saying that Muslims have rights too, as the way he would like to develop the argument. I'm sorry, but this is all part of the debate, and adjudicators, we cannot notice these things. Because when we develop the argument over here, that force is the only thing he will respond to, they say you'll never have enough money. Every oppressed group in the world will never ever raise as much money as redneck people out there. That's just fact. But that does not mean you give them a little bit of money to help. Because sometimes you need staples and sometimes you need paper. And sometimes you go cyclostep, yeah, it's an old technology, and to produce papers and distribute them. That's our proposal from the start. They are at a huge disadvantage. They are being hit by an unrelenting government. We want to give support from this government's indirect support from this fund. They only focused on one fund because that's the only one they knew. Then they kept on saying that that doesn't matter because eventually it'll divide people. Of course it'll divide people, but we are trying to make sure that these people, the homosexuals, their point of view, their rights are being championed so that one day that will be recognized. But maybe not immediately, but we must fight it, right? And that's what we propose this debate. But we would like to ask you to speak after all the hurry-burry's end. What did they want? Other than the fact they think there are not enough tires in Russia. We beg to propose.
Cheers, it's fun. Cheers. Okay.
This thing cracks me up.